Have you ever felt so lost, so far from everything you knew, that you wondered if hope was even possible anymore? Have you ever stared at a situation so broken, so completely shattered that the very idea of restoration seemed like a cruel joke? Imagine for a moment that you are that person, and then in your darkest hour, the sky itself rips open, and you are given a vision so profound, so mind-bending, that it changes not only your future, but your entire understanding of reality. That is the journey we are about to embark on. We will walk alongside a man named Ezekiel, a prophet whose visions were so spectacular they sound like scenes from the greatest science fiction epic ever conceived. But this is not fiction. This is a story of divine judgment, unimaginable devastation, and a promise of resurrection so powerful it can make dry, dead bones rise up and form a mighty army. And I promise you, the end of this story, the final vision Ezekiel receives, will redefine everything you thought you knew about hope and what it truly means for God to be present with His people. Before we dive into this incredible saga, I want to know where you are in the world and what time it is for you. It helps us feel connected as a community, exploring these truths together. Drop your city and the time in the comments below, and let's begin this journey into the heart of one of the most astonishing books ever written. Imagine this. You are sitting by the banks of a river in a foreign land, an exile, torn from your home, your culture, and your God. The sun beats down on the flat Mesopotamian landscape, a world away from the familiar hills of Judah. Suddenly, the ordinary blue sky above you begins to crackle with an energy that is not of this world. The heavens themselves seem to tear open like a celestial curtain, revealing a reality so staggering it would bring any mortal to their knees. This is precisely what happened to a young priest named Ezekiel, a man living this very exile more than 2,500 years ago. What he witnessed on that fateful day would not only irrevocably alter the course of his own life, but would reshape the entire understanding of God's awesome power and inescapable presence. Prepare yourself to step into a world where the impossible becomes tangible, where divine beings appear in spectacles that would dwarf the most breathtaking scenes from the grandest film you have ever watched. This isn't just a dry recounting of ancient history. This is the very beginning of one of the most magnificent spiritual odysseys ever recorded. Ezekiel was 30 years old, the age a priest would typically begin his service in the temple at Jerusalem. But there was no temple for him. He was living among his fellow Jewish exiles by the Kebar River, a large irrigation canal in the heart of Babylon. His ordinary day was about to become anything but. As recorded in the opening of his prophecy, in his 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while he was among the exiles by the Kebar River, the heavens were opened, and he saw visions of God. The sky above him did not just open, it split apart. And from this divine rupture, a tempestuous storm cloud of impossible proportions materialized. This was no ordinary meteorological event. This was a living storm, a whirlwind of cosmic power. Continuous, brilliant flashes of lightning erupted from within its churning depths, and the entire cloud was enveloped in a radiant, fiery glow that seemed to pulse with an intense, otherworldly life. From the very heart of this supernatural maelstrom, something even more astounding emerged. 4 living creatures stepped forth from the fire, and they were unlike anything Ezekiel had ever seen or could have possibly imagined in his wildest dreams or most terrifying nightmares. As he describes in verses 5 and 6, in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a human being, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. These were not merely unusual beings. They were glorious, powerful, and incandescently alien to this world. Each creature possessed the face of a human in the front, a feature that grounded them in a recognizable form, but that was just the beginning of their complexity. To the right, each bore the face of a lion, the undisputed king of all beasts, a symbol of raw power and royal majesty. To the left was the face of an ox, the epitome of faithful service, strength, and sacrifice. And at the back was the face of an eagle, the master of the skies, representing divine swiftness and a heavenly perspective that sees all things. Their bodies shimmered and gleamed like burnished bronze, reflecting the fiery light around them, and their wings were spread in a perfect, awe-inspiring formation. Their movement defied the laws of earthly locomotion. They did not need to turn their bodies as humans do. Instead, they could move in any of the four cardinal directions instantaneously, forward, backward, left, or right, without ever changing their orientation. Ezekiel notes in verse 12, "Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go without turning as they went." Their motion was fluid, immediate, and directed by a single unified will. But what made this vision truly phenomenal, what pushed it into the realm of the incomprehensible, was what appeared beneath them. Each of the four creatures stood beside a colossal wheel that touched the ground. These were not simple chariot wheels. These wheels challenged every law of physics Ezekiel knew. They sparkled and shone with the brilliance of chrysolite, a precious gemstone, and each wheel had another wheel set inside it, intersecting it at a right angle. This ingenious, impossible design meant they could roll in any direction without ever needing to turn, perfectly mirroring the movement of the living creatures above them. And then there were the eyes. The rims of these gigantic wheels were covered, completely and utterly, with eyes, not just a few, but a terrifying and magnificent multitude of them, as if the wheels themselves were alive, sentient, and capable of seeing everything in every direction at once. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved in perfect unison with them. When the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose as well. There was a flawless, symbiotic unity between them, as if they shared the very same spirit and purpose. The sound they produced was indescribable, a symphony of pure power. Ezekiel writes in verse 24, "When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings, like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army." It was the sound of raw, untamed force, the sound of heaven itself in motion. Above these incredible creatures was something that looked like a vast, crystalline expanse, an awesome firmament that stretched out like a solid dome of ice. The creatures' wings touched this expanse, and beneath it, their wings were spread out toward one another. Each creature had two wings covering its body in humility, and two wings stretched out, creating a sacred canopy of protection and reverence. What Ezekiel saw next took his breath away completely. Above the crystal expanse was something that looked like a throne, and this was no ordinary throne. It appeared to be crafted from lapis lazuli, the most beautiful and precious blue stone known to humanity, a stone of kings and gods. But the true wonder was not the throne itself, it was the one who sat upon it. Ezekiel 1:26 records, "Above the vault over their heads was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. This figure radiated an ineffable brightness and glory. From what seemed to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire. From the waist down, he appeared like fire itself, and a brilliant light enveloped him completely. The light was not harsh or painfully blinding. Instead, it was like seeing the most beautiful rainbow after a storm, but infinitely more magnificent." Ezekiel described it in verse 28, "Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord." This was not just a bright light. This was the very presence of God himself, the creator of the universe, choosing to reveal himself to a young, exiled priest. The same glory that had once filled Solomon's temple, the same presence that had led the Israelites through the desert as a pillar of fire, was now appearing directly to Ezekiel in a vision that would change everything. As Ezekiel lay prostrate on his face, trembling before this staggering vision, he heard a voice speaking to him. It was the voice of the one on the throne, and it carried an authority unlike anything he had ever heard. But first, a marvelous thing happened. The Spirit entered him and set him on his feet, giving him the strength to stand in the presence of God. The voice spoke with both tenderness and authority, addressing him as Son of Man, a title that emphasized his humanity in stark contrast to the divine glory before him. As recorded in Ezekiel 2-3, God said, "Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have been in revolt against me to this very day." This was not going to be an easy mission. God was being brutally honest about what Ezekiel would face. The people he was being sent to were described as obstinate and stubborn. They had hearts of stone and faces like flint set against God's message. They would be like thorns and briars, and Ezekiel would feel as if he were living among scorpions. But God's commission continued with both a warning and an encouragement. In verses 6 and 7, God said, "And you, Son of Man, do not be afraid of them or their words. Do not be afraid, though briars and thorns are all around you, and you live among scorpions. Do not be afraid of what they say, or be terrified by them, though they are a rebellious people. You must speak my words to them, whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious." This was perhaps the most challenging job description ever given. Ezekiel was being sent to a people who had a track record of rejecting God's messengers, of hardening their hearts to the truth, and of choosing their own paths over God's. They might listen or they might not. But that was not Ezekiel's responsibility. His job was simply to faithfully deliver God's message, regardless of their reaction. The commission came with a clear understanding that success would not be measured by how many people listened or changed their ways. Success would be measured by faithfulness to the message itself. God was not asking Ezekiel to be successful in human terms. He was asking him to be obedient. What happened next was unlike anything recorded in history. God handed Ezekiel a scroll, but this was no ordinary document. As described in Ezekiel 2:9, "Then I looked, and I saw a hand stretched out to me. In it was a scroll which he unrolled before me." This scroll was covered with writing on both sides, which was unusual for ancient documents. Typically, writing only appeared on one side to conserve the precious material. But this scroll was overflowing with God's message. The contents were not pleasant. It was filled with words of lament and mourning and woe. Then came the most extraordinary command Ezekiel had ever received. In chapter 3, verse 1, God said, "Son of man, eat what is before you. Eat this scroll, then go and speak to the people of Israel." This was not symbolic language. God was literally telling Ezekiel to consume the scroll that contained his prophetic message. Without hesitation, Ezekiel obeyed this incredible command. He opened his mouth and ate the scroll that God had given him. What happened next was completely unexpected. Even though the scroll was filled with messages of judgment and grief, when Ezekiel ate it, it tasted as sweet as honey in his mouth. This stunning transformation revealed something profound about God's word. Even when the message contains hard truths or warnings of judgment, there is something inherently sweet about receiving revelation from God. The bitterness of the message's content was overshadowed by the sweetness of the divine communication itself. God explained the meaning of this act in verse 4. "Then he said to me, Son of man, go now to the people of Israel and speak my words to them." The scroll was not just to be read by Ezekiel, it was to become a part of him. The message was now literally inside him, transformed from external words on a page to an internal conviction and calling. This was not just about memorizing a message or understanding a concept. Ezekiel had internalized God's word in the most complete way possible. Every word of judgment, every call to repentance, every promise of restoration was now as much a part of him as his own thoughts and feelings. After this incredible experience of eating the scroll, God gave Ezekiel one of the most sobering responsibilities ever entrusted to a human being. He was to become a watchman, not just any watchman, but a spiritual guardian responsible for the eternal well-being of God's people. In ancient times, a watchman stood on the city walls or a high tower, scanning the horizon for any sign of approaching danger. When they spotted an enemy or a threat, they would blow a warning trumpet to alert the city. The safety of everyone depended on the watchman's faithfulness and alertness. Now God was appointing Ezekiel to this same role, but in the spiritual realm, as recorded in Ezekiel 3:17. God said, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel, so hear the word I speak, and give them warning from me." This was not just about relaying messages. It was about taking responsibility for the people's spiritual safety and eternal destiny. God spelled out the gravity of this responsibility with crystal clarity. If a wicked person was heading toward spiritual destruction and Ezekiel failed to warn them, their blood would be on Ezekiel's hands. In verses 18 and 19, God said, "When I say to a wicked person, 'You will surely die,' and you do not warn them or speak out to dissuade them from their evil ways in order to save their life, that wicked person will die for their sin, and I will hold you accountable for their blood. But if you do warn the wicked person, and they do not turn from their wickedness or from their evil ways, they will die for their sin, but you will have saved yourself." The same principle applied to the righteous who might turn away from their faith. If they began to sin and Ezekiel didn't warn them of the consequences, he would be held responsible for their spiritual downfall. But if he faithfully delivered the warning, whether they listened or not, he was free of their blood. This created an immense burden of responsibility. Ezekiel was not just accountable for his own spiritual condition, he was accountable for every single person he was sent to warn. Their eternal fate depended in part on his faithfulness in delivering God's message. But with this great responsibility came great authority. God was not sending Ezekiel out empty-handed. Every word of warning, every call to repentance, every promise of restoration carried the full weight of divine power behind it. When Ezekiel spoke God's words, he was speaking with the same authority as God himself. God's method of communicating through Ezekiel was unlike anything seen before. Instead of just speaking words, God commanded Ezekiel to act out his messages through dramatic symbolic performances that would capture the people's attention and sear the truth into their memories. The first of these dramas began with something as simple as a brick. In Ezekiel 4:1, God commanded, "Now, son of man, take a block of clay, put it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it." This wasn't just an art project. This was the beginning of a powerful visual prophecy. After drawing Jerusalem on the brick, Ezekiel was told to lay siege to it. He built siege works around it, constructed earthen ramps, set up army camps, and placed battering rams against it on all sides. Then he took an iron pan and placed it as an iron wall between himself and the city, turning his face toward it to show that it was under siege. But the performance was only just beginning. God then gave Ezekiel an incredibly difficult command that would test his compliance to the absolute limit. He was to lie on his left side for 390 days, bearing the sin of the people of Israel. Then he was to lie on his right side for 40 days, bearing the sin of the people of Judah, 1 day for each year of their sin. During this entire time, Ezekiel had to keep his face turned toward the siege of Jerusalem and prophesy against it with his arm bared. God even bound him with ropes so he could not turn from one side to the other until the days of his siege were completed. The food restrictions were equally extreme. Ezekiel was commanded to eat only about 8 ounces of food a day and drink only about 2/3 of a quart of water. The food was to be made from a mixture of wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt. the kind of mixture people would eat during a siege when normal food supplies had been exhausted. Originally, God commanded Ezekiel to cook this food over human excrement, but when Ezekiel protested that he had never defiled himself with unclean food, God mercifully allowed him to use cow dung instead. This represented the unclean conditions the people would face during the siege of Jerusalem. Every aspect of this dramatic performance was significant. The 390 days represented the years of Israel's sin. The 40 days represented Judah's sin. The restricted food and water demonstrated the conditions in a siege. And the unclean fuel represented the spiritual defilement that would come upon the people. One of the most heart-wrenching aspects of Ezekiel's visions was witnessing something that had never happened before in Israel's history: the gradual departure of God's glory from the temple in Jerusalem. This was not a sudden abandonment, but a slow, reluctant withdrawal that showed God's patience even in judgment. The process began when Ezekiel was transported in a vision to Jerusalem, specifically to the entrance of the north gate of the inner court of the temple. What he saw there broke his heart. As recorded in Ezekiel 8:3, he stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God he took me to Jerusalem. What Ezekiel witnessed in the temple was spiritual adultery of the worst kind. There was an idol at the entrance that provoked God to jealousy. Digging through a wall, he discovered a secret chamber where 70 elders of Israel were burning incense to carved images of animals and detestable creatures. At the entrance to the north gate, women were sitting and weeping for the false god Tammuz. In the inner court, 25 men had their backs to the temple of the Lord, worshiping the sun toward the east. The temple that was meant to be the dwelling place of the Most High God had become a hub of pagan worship. The very leaders who should have been protecting the people's relationship with God were leading them into spiritual prostitution. It was in this context that the glory of the Lord began its slow departure. In chapter 9, verse 3, Ezekiel records, "Now the glory of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim where it had been, and moved to the threshold of the temple." This was the first movement. The glory that had rested above the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place moved to the doorway. The glory did not leave immediately. It paused at the threshold as if reluctant to go, giving an opportunity for repentance that never came. Then in chapter 10, verse 4, the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. The cloud filled the temple, and the court was full of the radiance of the glory of the Lord. The departure continued in stages. The glory moved from the threshold to the cherubim, and the cherubim spread their wings. In verse 18, then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. The living creatures that Ezekiel had seen in his first vision were now carrying God's presence away from its home. The final movement was the most devastating of all. In chapter 11, verse 23, Ezekiel witnessed the glory of the Lord go up from within the city and stop above the mountain to the east of it. The glory that had filled Solomon's temple, that had led the Israelites through the desert, that had been the center of their worship and identity, was now leaving completely. This was not God abandoning his people in a fit of anger. It was God being forced to leave because his holiness could no longer dwell in a place that had become so utterly defiled. The departure was gradual, giving multiple opportunities for repentance, but the people's hearts had become too hard to respond. The final aspect of Ezekiel's early ministry focused on the corrupt leadership that had led God's people astray. These were not ordinary citizens making personal mistakes. These were the princes, priests, and leaders who held positions of trust and authority, yet used their power to lead people away from God. In Ezekiel 11:1, the Spirit brought Ezekiel to the east gate of the Lord's house, where he saw 25 men, including Jazaniah and Pelatiah, who were leaders among the people. But instead of leading righteously, they were devising evil and giving wicked advice to the city. God revealed their thoughts to Ezekiel in the 3rd verse. They were saying, "Will it not be a long time before houses are built? This city is a cooking pot, and we are the meat in it." They believed they were safe, that Jerusalem was like a cooking pot that would protect them just as meat is protected inside a vessel. Their confidence was in the city walls and their own political schemes rather than in God's protection. These leaders had convinced themselves and others that they could continue their rebellion without consequence. They thought their strategic location, their fortifications, and their political alliances would keep them safe. They had completely forgotten that their security had always come from their relationship with God, not from human strength. God commanded Ezekiel to prophesy against these corrupt leaders. In the 4th verse, he said, "Therefore prophesy against them. Prophesy, Son of Man." The message was clear and devastating. Their plans would fail, their confidence was misplaced, and judgment was coming. The verdict was delivered swiftly and dramatically. While Ezekiel was prophesying, Pelatiah, son of Benaiah, died suddenly. This was no coincidence. It was a sign that God's words through Ezekiel carried immediate power and authority. The death of this leader served as a warning to all the others about the seriousness of their rebellion. The experience was so intense that Ezekiel fell face down and cried out, "Alas, sovereign Lord, will you completely destroy the remnant of Israel?" He was overwhelmed by the reality that God's judgment was not an empty threat, but an immediate reality. But even in judgment, God's heart of mercy was revealed. He explained that although he had scattered his people among the nations and countries, he himself would be a sanctuary for them in the nations where they had gone. The exile was not abandonment, it was discipline with a purpose. God promised a restoration in verses 17 through 20. "I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel. They will return to it and remove all its vile images and detestable idols. I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. Then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God." The corrupt leaders had hearts of stone, but God promised to give his people hearts of flesh. Where there had been division and rebellion, he would create unity and obedience. Where there had been spiritual adultery, he would restore a faithful relationship. The judgment on the leaders was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter of restoration and hope. After the astonishing visions and symbolic acts of his calling, God commanded Ezekiel to perform another dramatic prophecy that would shake the hearts of all who witnessed it. This one would not be comfortable or easy. It would be a living portrait of the terror that was coming to Jerusalem. In Ezekiel 12:3, God gave Ezekiel a command that seemed almost impossible. "Therefore, Son of Man, pack your belongings for exile, and in the daytime as they watch, set out and go from where you are to another place. Perhaps they will understand, though they are a rebellious house." Ezekiel was to pack his bags like a refugee preparing to flee his homeland. But this was not just any packing. These were the belongings of an exile, the few precious items a person could carry when forced to leave everything else behind forever. The people watching would immediately understand what this meant, as many of them had already lived through this nightmare. During the day, while everyone could see him clearly, Ezekiel gathered his few possessions, packing only what an exile could carry, the bare essentials for survival in a foreign land. No luxuries, no family treasures, no comfortable reminders of home, just the basic necessities to sustain life. But the real drama unfolded in the evening, as recorded in verse 4. "During the day while they watch, bring out your belongings packed for exile. Then in the evening while they are watching, go out like those who go into exile." This was not just about packing, it was about acting out the actual moment of forced departure. As evening came, Ezekiel did something that would send a chill down everyone's spine. Instead of walking out his door like a normal person, he dug through the wall of his house with his own hands. This represented people so desperate to escape that they would break through walls rather than use the doors, trying to avoid capture by enemy soldiers. With his belongings on his shoulder, Ezekiel covered his face and went out through the hole he had made in the wall. The covered face demonstrated the shame and grief of exile, a people too heartbroken to look back at what they had lost, too afraid to see what lay ahead. The next morning, God explained the meaning of this powerful drama. In verse 10, he said, "Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. This prophecy concerns the prince in Jerusalem and all the people of Israel who are there." This was not just about the common people. It was about their leaders, including the king himself. Ezekiel was told to explain in verse 11, "Say to them, I am a sign to you. As I have done, so it will be done to them. They will go into exile as captives." Every action Ezekiel had performed would be experienced by the people in Jerusalem. The pack, the breaking through the wall, the covered faces, the desperate escape, it would all become their reality. The prophecy became even more specific about their leader. In verse 12, God revealed, "The prince among them will put his belongings on his shoulder at dusk and leave, and a hole will be dug in the wall for him to go through. He will cover his face so that he cannot see the land." Even the king would suffer this humiliation, fleeing like a common refugee through a hole in the wall. But the most devastating part was yet to come. God declared in verse 13, "I will spread my net for him, and he will be caught in my trap. I will bring him to Babylonia, the land of the Chaldeans, but he will not see it, and there he will die." The king would be captured, blinded, and taken to Babylon, where he would die without ever seeing the land of his captivity. While Ezekiel was faithfully delivering God's true messages through dramatic demonstrations, Jerusalem was plagued by false prophets who were telling the people exactly what they wanted to hear. These were not just misguided religious teachers, they were dangerous charlatans leading people toward destruction with lies disguised as divine revelation. In Ezekiel 13:2, God commanded Ezekiel to take a stand against these frauds. "Son of man, prophesy against the prophets of Israel who are now prophesying. Say to those who prophesy out of their own imagination, hear the word of the Lord." These so-called prophets were not receiving visions from God. They were making up messages from their own minds. God's condemnation was swift and fierce. In the 3rd verse, he declared, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to the foolish prophets who follow their own spirit and have seen nothing." They claimed to have visions, but they had seen nothing from God. They were spiritual frauds, leading people astray with their own imaginations. These false prophets were compared to jackals among ruins in the 4th verse. Just as jackals scavenge in destroyed places without rebuilding anything, these prophets were feeding on the spiritual ruin of God's people without offering any real help or hope. They were parasites, not healers. The most tragic part was their timing. In verse 5, God exposed their true nature. "You have not gone up to the breaks in the wall to repair it for the people of Israel, so that it will stand firm in the battle on the day of the Lord." When God's people needed true spiritual leadership the most desperately, these false prophets were nowhere to be found. They offered no real strength, no real protection, no practical solutions to the crisis. Instead, they told lies and claimed divine authority for their deception. The 6th verse exposed their method. Their visions are false and their divinations a lie. Even though the Lord has not sent them, they say, "The Lord declares," and expect him to fulfill their words. They were putting words in God's mouth that he had never spoken, then expecting him to make their lies come true. But the false prophecy problem was not limited to men. There were also women who were practicing a form of spiritual deception that was equally dangerous. In verse 17, God commanded, "Now, son of man, set your face against the daughters of your people who prophesy out of their own imagination. Prophesy against them." These false prophetesses had developed a complex system of magical practices designed to entrap human souls. As described in verse 18, this is what the sovereign Lord says: "Woe to the women who sew magic charms on all their wrists and make veils of various lengths for their heads in order to ensnare people. Will you ensnare the lives of my people but preserve your own?" They were creating physical objects, charms, and veils that they claimed had spiritual power. People were paying them for these items, believing they would provide protection or spiritual insight. But these women were actually trapping people in deception, preying on their spiritual hunger for personal gain. God revealed their mercenary motivation. In verse 19, "You have profaned me among my people for a few handfuls of barley and scraps of bread. By lying to my people who listen to lies, you have killed those who should not have died and have spared those who should not live." They were selling false spiritual comfort to people who were headed toward judgment while failing to warn those who truly needed to repent. The verdict against all these false spiritual leaders was absolute. In verse 20, God declared his intention to tear away their tools of deception. "Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says: I am against your magic charms with which you ensnare people like birds, and I will tear them from your arms. I will set free the people that you ensnare like birds." After exposing the false prophets, God gave Ezekiel a parable that would cut to the heart of Jerusalem's true spiritual condition. This was not a gentle metaphor. It was a devastating comparison that revealed how far the chosen city had fallen from its intended purpose. In Ezekiel 15:2, God asked a question that seemed simple but carried profound implications. "Son of man, how is the wood of a vine different from a branch of any of the trees in the forest?" This question forced the people to think about what makes a grapevine special and valuable. Everyone knew the answer. A grapevine is valuable for one thing only: producing grapes. Unlike other trees that can be used for building or making tools, vine wood is soft, weak, and essentially useless for any practical construction purposes. Its entire value rests on its ability to bear fruit. God emphasized this point further. In the third verse, "Is wood ever taken from it to make anything useful? Do they make pegs from it to hang things on?" The answer was obviously no. No one makes furniture from vine wood. No one carves tools from it. No one even makes simple pegs to hang things on. The vine is too weak and unreliable for any of these purposes. This led to the devastating application of the parable. Jerusalem was like a vine that God had specifically chosen to produce the divine fruit of being a light to the nations, of demonstrating God's character to the world. But instead of producing the fruit it was created for, Jerusalem had become spiritually barren. And just as a useless vine is good for only one thing, to be burned as fuel, Jerusalem in its fruitless state was fit only for God's consuming judgment. In the fourth verse, God made this explicit. "And after it is thrown on the fire as fuel, and the fire burns both ends and chars the middle, is it then useful for anything?" The imagery became even sharper. Even after the vine had been partially burned, it became completely worthless. The charred remains couldn't be used for anything at all. This represented Jerusalem's condition. After experiencing God's partial judgment, instead of repenting and returning to fruitfulness, the city had become even more hardened and useless. In verse 6, God applied the parable directly. "Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says: As I have given the wood of the vine among the trees of the forest as fuel for the fire, so will I treat the people who live in Jerusalem." Jerusalem's fate was sealed not because God was cruel, but because the city had failed to fulfill its purpose and had become spiritually worthless. The judgment was not arbitrary. It was the inevitable consequence of fruitlessness. Just as a farmer eventually removes a barren vine that takes up space without producing grapes, God was removing Jerusalem because it had failed to produce the divine fruit it had been planted to bear. What came next was perhaps the most powerful and disturbing allegory in all of Scripture. God told Ezekiel to present the spiritual history of Jerusalem as the story of an abandoned baby who grew up to become an unfaithful wife. This was not just a story. It was a raw, emotional account of betrayal that would make the people understand the depth of their spiritual adultery. The story began with an image that would break any heart. In Ezekiel 16:4, God described Jerusalem's origin. On the day you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to make you clean, nor were you rubbed with salt or wrapped in cloths. This was a completely abandoned baby, left for dead, without even the most basic care any newborn needs to survive. Verse 5 painted an even more tragic picture. No one looked on you with pity or had compassion enough to do any of these things for you. Instead, you were thrown out into the open field, for on the day you were born, you were despised. This baby was not just forgotten, she was actively rejected and discarded like trash. But then came God's moment of rescue. In verse 6, God revealed his intervention. Then I passed by and saw you kicking about in your blood, and as you lay there in your blood, I said to you, live. God did not just walk past the dying infant. He commanded her to live and took personal responsibility for her survival. Under God's care, the abandoned baby began to thrive. Verse 7 described her maturation. I made you grow like a plant in the field. You grew up and developed and entered puberty. Your breasts were formed and your hair grew, but you were still stark naked. God had brought her from the brink of death to the beauty of young womanhood. As she reached maturity, God's relationship with her changed from guardian to husband. In verse 8, he declared, later I passed by, and when I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, and you became mine. This was the moment of their spiritual marriage. God chose Jerusalem as his bride. The blessings that followed were extraordinary. God clothed her in the finest materials, embroidered cloth, leather sandals, fine linen, and costly garments. He adorned her with jewelry, bracelets, a necklace, a ring, and a beautiful crown. He fed her the finest foods, honey, olive oil, and the best flour. She became exceedingly beautiful and rose to be a queen among the nations. But success corrupted her heart. In verse 15, the tragic turn began. But you trusted in your beauty and used your fame to become a prostitute. You lavished your favors on anyone who passed by, and your beauty became his. The very gifts God had given her became the tools of her spiritual adultery. The adultery was not just occasional unfaithfulness, it was systematic spiritual prostitution. She took the clothes God had given her and made shrines to false gods. She took the jewelry he had provided and made idols. She even took the food he provided and offered it to other gods as fragrant incense. But the most horrific aspect was yet to be revealed. In verse 20, God exposed the ultimate abomination. And you took your sons and daughters whom you bore to me and sacrificed them as food to the idols. Was your prostitution not enough? She had taken the very children of her marriage to God and sacrificed them to false gods, the ultimate betrayal of trust and love. The allegory continued with devastating detail, showing how Jerusalem actually paid other nations to be her lovers. Instead of being paid like a normal prostitute, she reversed the natural order, giving gifts to her spiritual lovers instead of receiving them. God's next message came in the form of a riddle that would puzzle everyone who heard it, until Ezekiel explained its meaning. This was not just a nature story. It was a political prophecy disguised as a parable about eagles and trees. In Ezekiel 17:2, God commanded, "Son of man, set forth an allegory and tell it to the people of Israel as a parable." What followed was a story that seemed simple on the surface, but contained layers of meaning that would reveal the political drama happening all around them. The riddle began with the image of a great eagle in the 3rd verse. Say to them, "This is what the sovereign Lord says." A great eagle with powerful wings, long feathers, and full plumage of varied colors came to Lebanon. Taking hold of the top of a cedar, he broke off its topmost shoot and carried it away to a land of merchants, where he planted it in a city of traders. This great eagle represented Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, with his powerful military might. The cedar tree was the royal house of Judah, and the topmost shoot was King Jehoiachin, whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried off to Babylon in the first deportation. But the eagle did not just take, he also planted. Verse 5 continued the story. He took one of the seedlings of the land and put it in a fertile field. He planted it like a willow by abundant water, and it sprouted and became a low, spreading vine. This seedling was Zedekiah, whom Nebuchadnezzar had placed on the throne as a puppet king. The arrangement seemed to be working well. The vine grew and spread, but it remained low and under the control of the eagle that had planted it. This represented the tributary relationship where Judah would remain a kingdom, but under Babylonian authority. However, the story took a sudden turn in the 7th verse. But there was another great eagle with powerful wings and plenty of feathers. The vine now sent its roots toward him from the plot where it was planted, and stretched out its branches to him for water. This second eagle was Egypt, and the vine turning toward it represented King Zedekiah's decision to seek Egyptian help in a rebellion against Babylon. The question posed in verse 9 revealed the foolishness of this decision. Will it thrive? Will it not be uprooted and stripped of its fruit so that it withers? All its new growth will wither. It will not take a strong arm or many people to pull it up by the roots. The vine that tried to serve 2 eagles would be destroyed by both. God then revealed his personal involvement in this political drama. In verse 16, he declared, "As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, he shall die in Babylon, in the land of the king who put him on the throne, whose oath he despised, and whose treaty he broke." Zedekiah's rebellion was not just against Nebuchadnezzar. It was against God himself, who had ordained the Babylonian king's authority. The verdict was swift and certain. Verse 20 declared, "I will spread my net for him, and he will be caught in my trap. I will bring him to Babylon and execute judgment on him there because he was unfaithful to me." God would personally ensure that the rebellious king faced justice for his oath-breaking and unfaithfulness. But the parable ended with a note of hope. In verse 22, God promised, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will take a shoot from the very top of a cedar and plant it. I will break off a tender sprig from its topmost shoots and plant it on a high and lofty mountain." This represented God's promise to raise up a future king from the line of David who would rule in righteousness. After delivering these harsh judgments on the nation as a whole, God revealed a principle that would revolutionize the way people understood divine justice. This was not just about national consequences, it was about individual responsibility and the possibility of personal redemption, even in the midst of a nation under judgment. This principle was introduced through a common saying that people were using to excuse their circumstances. In Ezekiel 18:2, God addressed this excuse. "What do you people mean by quoting this proverb about the land of Israel? The parents eat sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge." People were claiming they were suffering for their ancestors' sins, not their own. God's response was absolute and final. In the 3rd verse, he declared, "As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, you will no longer quote this proverb in Israel." The era of blaming previous generations was officially over. Every person would be held accountable for their own choices and actions. To illustrate this principle, God presented 3 generations of one family with different moral choices. The first generation was represented by a righteous man described in verse 5. Suppose there is a righteous man who does what is just and right. This man followed God's laws completely. He did not worship idols, commit adultery, oppress others, or charge interest on loans. He fed the hungry, clothed the naked, and executed true justice. The verdict for this righteous man was clear in verse 9. He follows my decrees and faithfully keeps my laws. That man is righteous. He will surely live, declares the sovereign Lord. His righteousness guaranteed his life and God's blessing. But then God presented the second generation, the son of this righteous man who chose a completely different path. In verse 10, the scenario changed. Suppose he has a violent son who sheds blood or does any of these other things. This son committed every sin his father had avoided: murder, adultery, oppression, theft, and idolatry. The question was primary. Would this wicked son be protected by his father's righteousness? God's answer was emphatic in verse 13. Will such a man live? He will not. Because he has done all these detestable things, he is to be put to death. His blood will be on his own head. A parent's righteousness provided no protection for personal wickedness. The third generation completed the illustration. In verse 14, God presented another possibility. But suppose this son has a son who sees all the sins his father commits, and though he sees them, does not do such things. This grandson chose righteousness, despite his father's terrible example. The grandson's fate was determined by his own choices, not his family history. Verse 17 declared, he withholds his hand from mistreating the poor, and takes no interest or profit from them. He keeps my laws and follows my decrees. He will not die for his father's sin. He will surely live. A wicked father could no more condemn a righteous son than a righteous grandfather could save a wicked grandson. God summarized the principle with perfect clarity in verse 20. The one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them. But the most wonderful part was the possibility of personal transformation. In verse 21, God revealed that even the most wicked person could change their destiny. But if a wicked person turns away from all the sins they have committed and keeps all my decrees and does what is just and right, that person will surely live. They will not die. Past sins did not have to define future destiny. As Jerusalem's political situation deteriorated rapidly, God commanded Ezekiel to compose a funeral song for the royal family. This was not just poetry, it was a prophetic lament that would capture the tragedy of a leadership that had failed to protect God's people. In Ezekiel 19:1, God commanded, "Take up a lament concerning the princes of Israel." This was a mourning song, the kind sung at funerals when great leaders died. But these princes were not yet dead. This was a prophecy of their coming doom. The lament began with a powerful metaphor in the second verse. What a lioness was your mother among lions. She lay down among them and raised her cubs. The mother lioness represented the royal line of David, specifically the kingdom of Judah. She was strong and noble, raising her sons among other powerful leaders. The first cub grew up to become a fearsome predator. The third verse described his development. She brought up one of her cubs, and he became a strong lion. He learned to tear the prey, and he became a man-eater. This represented King Jehoahaz, who ruled for only 3 months before being captured. But his reign was cut short by foreign intervention. In the fourth verse, the lament continued. The nations heard about him, and he was trapped in their pit. They led him with hooks to the land of Egypt. Jehoahaz was taken captive by Pharaoh Necho and died in exile in Egypt, never to return to his homeland. The lioness did not give up after losing her first son. Verse 5 told of her next attempt. When she saw her hope unfulfilled, her expectation lost, she took another of her cubs and made it a strong lion. This second cub was Jehoiachin, who seemed destined for greater success than his predecessor. This second lion also became strong and dangerous. The 6th verse described his reign. He prowled among the lions, for he had become a strong lion. He learned to tear the prey and became a man-eater. Like his predecessor, he ruled with violence and oppression, devouring his own people. His destructive behavior extended beyond personal violence. Verse 7 showed the scope of his damage. He broke down their strongholds and devastated their towns. The land and all who were in it were terrified by his roaring. This king destroyed the very infrastructure and communities he was supposed to protect, but his fate was even worse than the first cubs. In verse 8, the lament described his capture. Then the nations came against him, those from regions round about. They spread their net for him, and he was trapped in their pit. Unlike the first king who was taken by a single nation, this one faced a coalition of enemies. The end was swift and final. The 9th verse concluded his story. With hooks, they pulled him into a cage and brought him to the king of Babylon. They put him in prison, so his roar was heard no more on the mountains of Israel. Jehoiakim was taken to Babylon in chains, and his powerful voice was silenced forever. The lament then shifted metaphors, comparing the royal line to a vine that had once been highly productive and strong. Verse 10 painted a picture of its former glory. Your mother was like a vine in your vineyard planted by the water. It was fruitful and full of branches because of abundant water. This represented the kingdom during its prosperous years, but success led to pride and destruction. Verse 12 described the catastrophe, but it was uprooted in fury and thrown to the ground. The east wind made it shrivel, its fruit was stripped off, its strong branches withered, and fire consumed them. The east wind represented the Babylonian invasion that would destroy everything. The final image was one of complete desolation. Verse 13 concluded the lament, now it is planted in the desert, in a dry and thirsty land. The royal vine that had once flourished by abundant water was now withering in exile, far from its source of strength and life. For the final symbolic act in this section, God gave Ezekiel one of the most vivid and disturbing parables yet. Jerusalem was not just a city under siege. It was like a cooking pot that had become so corroded and filthy that it could never be cleaned again. The prophecy came on a specific date in Ezekiel 24:1. In the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day, the word of the Lord came to me. This was not a random day. This was the exact day that Nebuchadnezzar began his final siege of Jerusalem. While the attack was beginning hundreds of miles away, God revealed it to Ezekiel in real time. God commanded Ezekiel to record this date in verse 2. Son of man, record this date this very day, because the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day. This prophecy would be proof that God knew exactly what was happening and when. The parable began simply enough in the 3rd verse. Tell this rebellious people a parable and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Put on the cooking pot, put it on, and pour water in it. At first, this sounds like normal preparation for cooking, but as the instructions continued, the true meaning became clear. The 4th verse revealed what was to be put in the pot. Put the pieces of meat into it, all the choice pieces, the leg and the shoulder. Fill it with the best of these bones. The meat represented the people of Jerusalem, and the choicest pieces represented the nobility and leadership. The cooking process began in verse 5. Take the best of the flock, pile wood beneath it for the bones, bring it to a boil, and cook the bones in it. This was the siege of Jerusalem. The city was being heated by the fire of war, and the people inside were being cooked by the pressure and violence. But then God revealed the real problem with this pot. In the 6th verse, he declared, for this is what the sovereign Lord says, woe to the city of bloodshed, to the pot now encrusted, whose deposit will not go away. Empty it piece by piece, regardless of the order in which it comes. The pot was corroded with rust, and a deposit that could not be cleaned. The rust and corrosion represented the bloodshed and accumulated sin that had built up in Jerusalem over generations. Just as rust weakens metal and makes it unusable, the moral corrosion had weakened the city to the point of no return. Verse 7 identified the source of this corruption. For the blood she shed is in her midst. She poured it on the bare rock. She did not pour it on the ground, where the dust would cover it. The city had committed its murders so openly and brazenly that the blood cried out for vengeance. The verdict was both just and unavoidable. In verse 8, God explained his response. To stir up my wrath and take revenge, I put her blood on the bare rock, so that it would not be covered. God himself ensured that Jerusalem's crimes would not be hidden or forgotten. The corruption was so complete that normal cleaning would not work. Verse 11 described the drastic measures needed. Then set the empty pot on the coals till it becomes hot and its copper glows, so its impurities may be melted and its deposit burned away. The only way to deal with this level of corruption was to heat the pot until the metal itself glowed and the rust was burned off. But even this extreme treatment failed. Verse 12 revealed the hopeless situation. It has frustrated all efforts. Its heavy deposit has not been removed, not even by fire. The corruption was so deep and complete that even the most intense purification could not clean it. The final verdict was devastating in verse 13. Now your impurity is lewdness. Because I tried to cleanse you, but you would not be cleansed from your impurity, you will not be clean again until my wrath against you has subsided. The pot was beyond saving and would have to be completely destroyed. After delivering these devastating prophecies against Jerusalem, God's attention turned to the nations surrounding Israel. These were not random judgments against distant peoples. They were targeted pronouncements against the specific neighbors who had celebrated Jerusalem's downfall and taken advantage of God's people in their darkest hour. The first nation to face judgment was Ammon, located to the east of the Jordan River. In Ezekiel 25:2, God commanded, "Son of man, set your face against the Ammonites and prophesy against them." The Ammonites were descendants of Lot, making them distant relatives of Israel, but they had shown no family loyalty when Jerusalem fell. Their crime was revealed in the 3rd verse. Say to them, "Hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because you said, 'Aha,' over my sanctuary, when it was desecrated, and over the land of Israel, when it was laid waste, and over the people of Judah when they went into exile." The Ammonites had literally celebrated when God's temple was destroyed and his people were dragged away in chains. This was not just political rivalry, it was spiritual mockery. They had rejoiced when the place where God's name dwelt was profaned and destroyed. Their aha was a cry of victory over what they saw as the failure of the God of Israel, not just the army of Israel. The punishment would fit the crime perfectly. In verse 4, God declared, "Therefore I am going to give you to the people of the east as a possession. They will set up their camps and pitch their tents among you. They will eat your fruit and drink your milk." The very people the Ammonites thought would protect them would instead consume everything they had. Their capital city would become a pasture for animals. In verse 5, "I will turn Rabbah into a pasture for camels, and Ammon into a resting place for sheep. Then you will know that I am the Lord." The city where they had celebrated Israel's destruction would become a grazing ground for wandering flocks. Next came Moab, another descendant of Lot. Their sin was different but equally serious. In verse 8, God revealed their offense. "This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because Moab and Seir said, 'Look, Judah has become like any other nation.'" Moab had denied the uniqueness of God's relationship with his people, claiming Judah was no different than any pagan nation. This was a direct attack on God's character and his covenant faithfulness. By saying Judah was just like other nations, Moab was essentially declaring that the God of Israel was powerless and no different than the false gods of other peoples. The verdict against Moab would expose the flank of their country in verse 9. Therefore I will expose the flank of Moab, beginning at its frontier towns, Beth Jeshimoth, Baal Meon, and Kiriathaim, the glory of that land. Their strongest defensive positions would be stripped away, leaving them vulnerable to invasion. The judgment on Edom was perhaps the most personal of all. These were the descendants of Esau, Jacob's twin brother, making them the closest blood relatives of Israel among the nations. But their behavior during Jerusalem's crisis was truly devastating. Their crime was revealed in verse 12. This is what the sovereign Lord says, because Edom took revenge on Judah and became very guilty by doing so. When Judah was already suffering under the Babylonian attack, Edom took the opportunity to settle old scores and inflict further damage on their wounded relatives. This was not just opportunistic raiding, it was calculated vengeance that revealed a deep-seated hatred that had persisted for generations. They had waited for their moment of weakness and then attacked with vicious brutality. God's response would be equally personal and devastating. In verse 13, he declared, Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will stretch out my hand against Edom and kill both man and beast. I will lay it waste, and from Teman to Dedan, they will fall by the sword. The entire nation would be devastated from north to south, but the most shocking aspect of Edom's punishment was who would carry it out. Verse 14 revealed, I will take vengeance on Edom by the hand of my people Israel, and they will deal with Edom in accordance with my anger and my wrath. They will know my vengeance, declares the sovereign Lord. Israel themselves would eventually be God's instrument of revenge on their treacherous relatives. The final neighbor to face judgment was the Philistines, the ancient enemies who lived along the Mediterranean coast. Their crime was described in verse 15. This is what the sovereign Lord says, because the Philistines acted in vengeance and took revenge with malice in their hearts, and with ancient hostility sought to destroy Judah. Like Edom, they had used Judah's weakness as an opportunity to settle ancient grudges. The phrase ancient hostility pointed to centuries of conflict between these peoples. From the time of Samson and David, the Philistines had been persistent enemies of God's people. Now they thought they saw their chance to finish what they had started long ago, but their celebration would be short-lived. In verse 16, God declared their doom. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am about to stretch out my hand against the Philistines, and I will wipe out the Kerethites and destroy those remaining along the coast. The coastal cities that had been the center of Philistine power for centuries would be